Hello and welcome back to Unsustainable. When people think about resource shortages, they usually think about oil, gas, rare earths, maybe water. They usually don't think about sand. But modern construction uses extraordinary amounts of it. And in many parts of the world, the environmental damage from sand mining is already becoming severe. That might sound slightly absurd at first, because sand seems too ordinary to be a crisis. It's just sand. It's on beaches, in rivers, in deserts. It feels almost infinite. But that's part of why this issue is so easy to miss. Sand is one of the most taken for granted materials in modern life, while also being one of the most heavily used. UNEP says sand and gravel are the second most used resource in the world after water, and that humanity uses around 50 billion tons of them every year. And once you start noticing where that sand goes, the scale gets harder to ignore. It goes into concrete, roads, buildings, bridges, glass, infrastructure, entire cities. So this is not some niche material used in one obscure industry. A huge amount of modern life depends on sand and gravel, especially the kinds used in construction. UNEP says we use enough each year to build a wall 27 meters high and 27 meters wide around the Earth. That's such a ridiculous number that it almost stops sounding real. But it helps explain why this matters. The issue is not just that we use a lot of sand. The issue is where a lot of it comes from, and what happens when we take too much of it from places that are already doing important ecological work. Because sand in a river, on a coastline, or on the seabed is not just a convenient raw material waiting to be scooped up. It's often part of how those environments function. UNEP says extraction from rivers, coasts, and marine ecosystems can drive erosion, salinization of aquifers, biodiversity loss, and weaken storm protection. It can also affect fisheries, tourism, water supplies, food production, and livelihoods. So this is not only a resource issue, it's also a habitat issue, a water issue, a coastal resilience issue, and in some places a community survival issue. And I think that's the point where the whole topic starts to feel different. Because at first it sounds like a dry material story. Then you realize it's about what really happens when one of the most heavily used materials on Earth is extracted at huge scale from living systems. A good example of that is marine dredging. UNEP says around 6 billion tons of sand and other sediments are extracted from the marine environment every year, and describes that as more than 1 million dump trucks a day. It also gives a broader estimate of 4 to 8 billion tons annually from marine and coastal environments. That's a staggering level of extraction. And again, the problem is not just the number by itself. The problem is that these are not empty places in any meaningful ecological sense. Marine and coastal sediments help shape shorelines. They support seabed ecosystems. They help buffer coasts. They play a role in the relationship between rivers, deltas, beaches, and the sea. So when extraction happens at the wrong scale or in the wrong places, the damage can travel outwards in ways that are not immediately obvious. UNEP says the world is approaching the natural replenishment rate that rivers need to maintain coastal and marine ecosystem structure and function, which is estimated at around 10 to 16 billion tons a year. That's an important point because it means this is not just a question of how much material exists in some broad planetary sense. It's also a question of whether the systems that naturally move and replace that material can keep up with what humans are taking. And in a lot of places, the answer seems to be no. There's also a governance problem. UNEP has reported that about 16% of dredging over the last decade occurred in marine reserves, and that up to 1/6 of dredging between 2018 and 2022 took place in marine protected areas. That's one of the details that makes the issue land, because it shows this is not just happening in some vague, unregulated nowhere. It's happening even in places that are supposed to have environmental significance and some level of protection. And once you move from the global level to a case study, the consequences become even clearer. The Mekong Delta is one of the strongest examples. A 2024 review in Science of the Total Environment describes the Vietnamese Mekong Delta as a global hotspot for sand mining, with estimated extraction ranging from 8.5 to 45.7 million cubic meters per year. It links sand mining there to riverbank and coastal erosion, lower water levels, disrupted hydrology, and worse saltwater intrusion in the dry season. It also notes that illegal mining makes the problem harder to measure and regulate, Because it's not just that we have an alarming number on a UN report, it's that removing sand can physically reshape rivers and deltas, worsen erosion, disrupt water systems, and make already fragile places more vulnerable. That's not abstract. That's the material basis of an ecosystem being altered for construction somewhere else. And part of what makes this topic confusing is that people hear all of this and immediately think, hang on, how can sand be scarce? There are deserts everywhere. But the issue is not that the earth is about to run out of sand. The issue is that the kinds of sand and gravel used most heavily in modern construction are not all equally useful, equally located, or equally harmless to extract. UNEP's reporting focuses repeatedly on the environmental damage caused by taking construction sand and gravel from rivers, coasts, and shallow seas. So the real crisis is not a cartoon version where the planet suddenly has no sand left. It's a crisis of extraction, location, ecological function, and weak governance. And that distinction matters because it makes the story both accurate and more interesting. This is not really a panic about counting grains. It's about whether the places we mine this material from can withstand what we are doing to them. And right now, in many places, they clearly can't. Another reason this persists is that governance has not really caught up with the scale of the issue. UNEP has explicitly said there is no global standard for marine sand extraction and has called for an international standard, better monitoring, and bans on beach extraction because of the importance of beaches to coastal resilience, ecosystems, and economies. So one of the world's most used materials is still being governed in a way that is patchy, inconsistent, and in some places barely adequate. That is quite a remarkable situation when you think about it, especially because sand mining is not always visible to the people benefiting from the material. People see a new building, a road, a tower block, a bridge. They do not usually see the riverbank erosion, the dredging vessel, the collapsing delta, or the disrupted ecosystem that helped supply the material. So the environmental cost stays detached from the final product. And that helps keep the issue obscure. There are at least some efforts underway to make the problem more visible. One of the most interesting is UNEP's Marine Sand Watch. Launched in 2023, it uses vessel tracking signals and AI to monitor large dredging vessels globally. And UNEP says it currently covers about 60% of dredging vessels worldwide, with the goal of improving that further. That obviously doesn't solve the problem itself, but it matters. Because one of the reasons environmentally destructive extraction continues is that it is often hard to see clearly, hard to measure consistently, and easy to ignore politically. So better monitoring is a real part of the solution. And then there is the question people usually ask near the end of any story like this, which is, what are the alternatives? UNEP points to a few. These include recycled construction materials, crushed rock, and ore sand from mining waste. That's promising, but I think it's worth being careful here. This is not the kind of topic where I want to say, don't worry, clever engineers have already fixed it, because they haven't. What we do seem to have are some possible ways to reduce pressure on virgin sand extraction, especially if governments, industry, and construction systems actually choose to use them. Australia gives a useful example on the recycling side. The 2024 National Waste Report says construction and demolition waste recovery rose from 72% to 81% in 2022-23, and describes demolition waste recycling as a success story that can provide alternative material for road base and construction aggregates. That doesn't mean recycled material can instantly replace everything, but it does show that part of the answer is not simply taking more virgin material forever. There are other pathways, even if they need scaling, investment, and proper standards. And I think that leads to the real point of this whole topic. Sand seems boring. That's probably its greatest disguise, because boring materials don't usually get treated as political or ecological flashpoints until the damage becomes very hard to ignore. And sand has been able to sit inside concrete, glass, roads, and urban growth without attracting the kind of public attention we give to oil, plastic, or fossil fuels. But in environmental terms, it deserves much more attention than it gets. Because once you start looking at the scale of extraction, the fragility of the places it comes from, and the weakness of the rules around it, it stops looking ordinary very quickly. It starts looking like exactly what it is: one of the foundational materials of modern development, extracted at extraordinary scale, often from ecosystems that are paying the price. So I don't think the lesson here is that the world is about to literally run out of sand in some simple cinematic sense. I think the more useful lesson is that one of the most heavily used materials on Earth is becoming an environmental crisis because of where we take it from, how much we take, and how poorly that extraction is governed. And once you see that, it becomes very hard to go back to thinking of sand as just an ordinary harmless backdrop to modern life. Because it isn't. It's part of the story of how modern development reshapes the natural world. And in many places, the bill for that is already arriving. Thanks for watching.